At this time, we're going to go ahead and pass things off to Brother Michael Brenneman, who has our lesson for this morning.
Thank you, Bill, for your prayer. We needed it and many more. Good morning, brothers and sisters. I hope you're doing well in the midst of all the things that are happening right now, things that are impacting every one of our lives. Some of you may be experiencing some mental conflict, as I am. I'm imagining that many of us are tired of constantly hearing about the coronavirus. You know, it fills the internet, fills the news, Facebook, our conversations, all the time. And it's not the most pleasant thing. So many of us are weary of hearing about it, but because it affects us, directly affects every single one of us, we also have a keen interest in it and a strong interest in it, and we should, because we need to keep in contact. Are there new techniques that can keep us safer? Have they developed a vaccine yet, to cure it? Because I keep waiting to hear that eating lots of Jamocha almond fudge will cure the coronavirus. So I am experimenting at this time, and it must work because I'm not sick yet. We need to know about the new laws as they extend deadlines or maybe shorten them someday. There's just so many things that direct us effectively, that affect us directly. We have to pay attention, and thus the conflict between interest and weariness. I'm not aware of if any of you are experiencing, fear or stress, anxiety at this time. We aren't seeing and talking to each other as much as we normally do, so it's hard for me to know. But one fact is for sure, and that this disease it's slamming us. It's slamming us like a great storm. And so we're going to be reading about a great storm today. It's recorded in 3 of the Gospels, but we'll be reading the one that's in Matthew 8:23 through 27. So let's go ahead and read that. And I'll say this as well. The scriptures come alive if we can develop the ability to read them and be there in our mind, to see as many of the details, to ask questions. Well, what would that experience be like, and how would I have felt? And they can really, truly be more meaningful, and we can get more details just by asking questions that a detective might ask. So with that, I will say that as I read this passage that you are all familiar with, you've heard it many times, more things came to light for me. I learned, even though I've read it and heard it many times, and I hope this blessing will pass to you as well. So let's begin in Matthew chapter 8, verse 23 through 27. When he, that's Jesus, got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was asleep. And they came to him and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." He said to them, "Why are you afraid, you men of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. The men were amazed. These are his apostles. The men were amazed and said, "What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" It's also recorded, should you want to write this down, this same episode with a few other details, in Mark chapter 4 and in Luke chapter 8. Now let's go ahead and look at some of the details. Back to Matthew 8:23 and 24. Jesus and the disciples had just been preaching, curing people. Just before they get into the boat, he had cured a woman who'd been suffering from a hemorrhage, from bleeding, for 12 years. None of the doctors could help her, and she was just getting worse. He cured a leper just by touching him. And he raised Jairus' daughter, who had died, just by speaking to her. They saw these things. He warned them. He taught them that the kingdom was like a house built on a rock, so that the winds and the waves slam into it. It stands, unlike a house built on the sand, which would mean a life without God. When a house is built on the sand and the winds and the sea slam into it, it destroys it. So he's just talked to them about that, and now they are going to get a chance to practice the lesson they just heard, because they're going to get slammed by the winds and the waves. So notice it says, and behold, there arose a great storm. That behold is a word that says, look at this. It means it happened quickly. It happened suddenly and unexpectedly. So it wasn't like they were expecting it. Whether Jesus knew that the storm was coming or not, we're not told. But the disciples certainly did not. And quickly, suddenly, there arose a great storm. So the boat being covered. I want to talk a little bit about that, because the English is good, great storm, but it doesn't convey the real impact of what was happening here. If you go to the Greek, whether you can read it or not, that great storm, Matthew writes in two words, megas seismos. You're familiar with the word mega. The Greek word mega means it's something that is huge, or it can stand for 1,000,000 units or something. Like with your computer, a megabyte is 1,000,000 bytes of storage, or 1,000,000 bytes of information. Megahertz has to do with 1,000,000 units of electricity. Mike Putterbaugh can tell you more about that. But it means huge. So this was a mega storm. But he didn't call it a storm. He called it a seismos. You're familiar with the word seismograph, because that's what measures earthquakes. And you're probably familiar with the word seismologist, because that is a person who studies earthquakes. In the Greek, it meant pretty much what it does in English. It meant a violent shaking, not a tremor. But a seismos is a violent shaking or commotion, most commonly used for the word earthquake. So picture being in this boat with the shores trembling and shaking. Is that what made the waves even bigger? Was the land underneath the Sea of Galilee, was it shaking? We're not told, but what we do know is this, that whoever was there, and it was Jesus and other boats with him, they knew exactly what was happening. Extremely powerful, extremely frightening. And Matthew calls it a great quaking, a great shaking. It's interesting that Mark and Luke use different words, equally as powerful. But before I get there, I want to point out that Matthew only uses this word seismos 3 times. Matthew says there was a seismos when Jesus died. There was a great, tremendous shaking of the earth, a severe earthquake, so severe it split rocks. When Jesus was resurrected from the dead, there was another severe earthquake, a great shaking of the earth that frightened people and the Roman guards. And there's only one other time when Matthew uses this word seismos in relation to Jesus. And it's right here in this storm. This must have been a doozy. Look at what the other Gospels say. In Mark 4, in the English it says it's a fierce gale in the New American Standard. The word for this fierce gale is mega again. It's megale, so it's the same word, a great, a tremendous, a huge Lilops instead of seismos, the earthquake. Lilops, according to Badag, the best Greek lexicon available, a lilops was a whirlwind or a hurricane. So when you envision this storm, does that give you a little bit clearer picture? Things were quaking. There was a great earthquake going on and a hurricane. Great winds or whirlwinds. It was so great, it made the waves huge. So here are three other descriptions about how severe the storm was. Jesus asked them, by the way, once they wake him up, he says, "Why are you afraid?" What's the answer? Jesus, are you kidding? We're afraid because the storm is so severe. In Matthew 8:24, it says the boat was being covered by the waves. Now, I don't know, I have a picture of a boat similar to the one they used back then. We'll show in a minute. But there was no cabin on this boat. It was an open boat so they could walk around the perimeter of the boat using their huge fishing nets, pulling them in, having a place to store the fish. There was no shelter. And the waves were crashing over the top of the boat. The men were wet, and certainly they were cold. In Mark 4, it says the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. That would be frightening. If you're on a 30-foot boat, 27.5-foot boat, and it's filling full of water. Luke says, and they began to be swamped and to be in danger. That's why they were afraid. Now, this is the boat, or one very similar to it, that they were using. They could have up to 4 oars. They found one in 1986, and then they built a replica. So this one, supposedly, I don't know if it's a model or full size, I couldn't find out. But it is 27.5 feet long. It could easily hold 13 men. I owned a boat very similar to this. It was 30 feet long. It was made out of wood. It was pointed on both ends, and it was a real piece of junk. But I know what it's like to be overloaded. Once we had 4,000 pounds of dogfish, 3,600 pounds of dogfish in this small boat. And you could tell, well, when they had it full of water, it would really make it hard to maneuver. They would be wet, knowing that more waves could fill the boat and it could possibly swamp. So this is why they're afraid. I'm not saying they should have been. Jesus is questioning the validity of their prayer for a couple of reasons. But this is similar to the boat. And before we move on to the next slide, just look on the right side of the screen. You'll see a little deck area, and that's where they usually put the big nets. The fishing nets were like 1/4 mile long, heavy material since they didn't have synthetics back then, like nylon or rayon, monocord. So you'll see that flat spot because we're going to read that Jesus was sleeping, and he was either sleeping on top of that flat spot, which would be my guess, or underneath. So Jesus is asking the question, why are you afraid? And it's because of the severity of the storm. The boat was being covered, as we've already read. So he might ask us when we are afraid, and he does ask us. When he says, don't be anxious for anything, don't worry, be courageous. He asks us, just like he does the disciples, why are you afraid? And our reply might be, Jesus, have you read the news? I mean, there's Al-Qaeda and ISIS. There are dictators that are collecting nuclear warheads like they're a common thing. There are financial threats. As Bill mentioned, Alex, who's been laid off from his work. Many of us are not allowed to go to work. We're losing our income. The government support will help a little bit, but it won't take care of all of our financial needs in most cases. So we have all these threatening things going on, including the coronavirus and how it's changing the way we live right now. And that would be our answer. Jesus, why are you afraid? Jesus, have you read the news? Do you know what's going on? Jesus himself was in the stern asleep. I wish this would be the first time you've ever heard. I don't, because I hope you've read your Bible many times, but the impact of reading about the storm and seeing it as it really was, and then visualizing Jesus on that flat area, asleep, as the boat is just getting tossed around, probably very exhausted from all the healings and all the teaching and lack of rest he had when he dealt with all the crowds just earlier that same day. And here's a man who's calm in the storm. Here's a man who's at peace, regardless of what's going on around him. So he's sleeping. And I want you to notice something else. It doesn't say he's dozing. It doesn't say he's napping. It doesn't say he's taking a little short rest. From what I can tell, Jesus is slumbering. Why they're afraid? He's sawing logs. And they woke him and they said to him, Teacher, do you not care? Don't you care that we are perishing? There's a lot of ugliness behind that statement. Do you not care? By asking the question, they're questioning God's character. You should care, God. It doesn't look like you care. They're questioning his goodness and the goodness of Jesus. Don't you care that we're perishing? And in this recording, in Matthew anyway, he responds by asking a question. He's going to ask them, as we've already said, why are you afraid? The reason he's so concerned that we, his people, have fear is because it messes with our thinking and it messes with our faith. It messes us up. When we worry, we make some hormones. I think cortisol is one of them. I don't know all the name, but they're so deadly when we are anxious and worrying, and anger too, but worry is the worst. I read that the hormones that we make hurt our body 8 times more than smoking cigarettes do. So fear really, it harms us. And I'd like to share something with you that I just learned in my study. Jesus gives a command. He says throughout his ministry, do not worry, or other ones similar to it. Fear not, don't be afraid, take courage. He gives this command 21 times in the recorded of the New Testament, 21 times. The second most frequent command he gives is to love. Love your God, love your neighbor, love your enemy. And by my count, he only commands us to love between 8 and 10 times. His most frequent command is, do not be afraid. Take courage. Now, you know that when someone, a boss, a parent, our Lord, gives us a command over and over again, it's because it's so critical. It's so important. And this is the most common, most frequent command that Jesus gives. I'm not saying it's more important than love. We know that loving God and loving your neighbor are the two greatest commandments there are. But we know that the two fight each other. We read in 1 John chapter 4 that perfect love casts out fear. So the two are in conflict. The amount we love and the amount we fear. And so Jesus gives us great value to try and impress us how important it is that we trust him. And we haven't got to that yet. But there's a way to reduce our fear. That's by trusting Jesus. Now, these men that were with him, they had just seen him do all these miracles I mentioned just previously, speaking a little girl back to life, touching a leper and restoring him, stopping the woman from hemorrhaging. They saw Jesus cure Peter's mother-in-law. She had a high fever. They've seen the miracles. But fear does something with our thinking. It messes with it. It messes with our memory. So they've seen the power of Jesus. They've had some faith in him. And then when they get overwhelmed with fear, they question Jesus' character. They become afraid, forgetting that the creator of the universe is in the boat with them. They forget that. They forget that he has the power to stop it. They question his goodness. Their thinking is not right. So Jesus responds to their question by saying, what are you afraid of? I want to make this point because it's important. Not all fear is sinful. Fear is a gift from God. For instance, some of you like to hike and spend time outdoors, as I do. And should you be going down, walking outdoors, and in the distance you see a mother black bear and two cubs with her, God is giving you the ability to experience fear, which I hope you will feel in that instance. Because most of us know that a mother bear who has cubs will attack anything around them. You want to back out. They say don't turn your back and run, but you want to back out and show that you're respecting their space and get out of there. If you wake up, you smell smoke, you see flames, your house is on fire, it's good to have fear because fear motivates us sometimes when used correctly. Fear motivates us to take action quickly. In fact, scientists have labeled the fight or flight syndrome. We either get courage to defend something like our family if they're in danger against a bad person, or run for our lives if our house is burning down. But fear is a gift from God, and I'm not at all saying it's a sin to feel fear. In fact, it is not. Sin is amoral. Sin is neither good or bad. It's really how we react when we have fear. Will it cause us to turn to something insignificant, something immoral? Some people in fear might turn to binge drinking or all the drugs we have available today, illicit or legal. It might caused some people to take matters into their own hand. I can do this. I've got to overcome this, leaving God out of the picture. But that's the biggest danger. And that's what the disciples did. When they were afraid, even though Jesus was in the boat, they took him out of the picture. This is too big. This storm is too great. We're going to die. They said, we are perishing. So what determines whether fear is appropriate or not is how we react to it. David had fear. Jesus, I think it's quite clear, when he was in the garden, he was under great stress for fear of what he was going to have to go through, sweating as of drops of blood, we're told. He was stressed unto death, we read, in both Matthew and Luke. But he responded to it the way we need to. He fell on his face and he prayed to the great God in heaven, who's powerful and loving and full of mercy, and a God who does care. And Jesus handled fear well. His response was appropriate because he never, ever sinned. And that's the goal. Last week I mentioned that whether the coronavirus is coming from the enemy, Satan, whether it's just time and chance, whether it's a wake-up call from God, we'll never know. And we don't need to know. What we do need to know is God is well aware of it. He will either choose to shorten it, or he will choose to let it go on for a while, because suffering, catastrophes bring people back to God, just like 9/11 did. And in the book of Judges, we mentioned that last week. Totally under his control. Let us never be so fearful that it messes with our thinking and our faith. Remember, we have a God who can handle this like any other situation that comes up. Let us turn to him in our faith and say, we know, God, you can change us at any moment, and we trust you. We don't like it. No one likes suffering. But Lord, help our hearts to be full of courage. Help our love for you and the people around us to be great, and to handle our fear in a way that makes you proud of us. So it's a gift from God. It is not always sinful, but quite often, fear is harmful to us and to others around us, whether we're short-tempered or mean-spirited, or we forget about them and focus on ourselves. And then, obviously, that's when fear is sinful. So Jesus asked the question. After they say, don't you care? He says, why are you afraid, you men of little faith? He equates fear and being overwhelmed by it. It's a good way to say it. He equates being overwhelmed by fear like they are to lacking faith. And he knows. Continuing in our reading, it says in the end of the first line, then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and he became perfectly calm. Perfectly calm would mean no waves at all. The water was glassy smooth, like a mirror. And it says, the men were amazed, and they said, what kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? They hadn't learned that yet, even though the information was available to them. But you'll see, as they spent more time with Jesus, as they grew to understand who he really was, they were able to answer the question, who is this man? They were able to answer this question. This is the Christ. This is the Son of the living God. And these apostles, except for Judas, the one who hung himself, These apostles became full of courage. Everyone, according to tradition and what we hear about, died a martyr's death except for the apostle John. They had great courage because they learned the lesson. What kind of man is this? I hope this is giving you something to think about. By no means exhaustive, and depending on the future and what happens, I do hope to do a small series on fear, because there's much we haven't developed yet, such as 2 Timothy 1:7, where we're told God hasn't given you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-discipline. And we didn't study in depth 1 John chapter 4, where it says that perfect love casts out fear. So I look forward to doing that, not because of the coronavirus. Believe it or not, I started this sermon at least a month ago, before I knew how bad the coronavirus threat would become, and before I knew about the restrictions on our activities. I chose to work on this sermon because it's something that good people, good women, faithful men struggle with at times. So I'm hoping this will give you a little bit of food for thought. May it fill your prayers. When we ask God, please God, help me develop the courage that it takes to be a shining light, so when others are afraid, I am calm in the storm. Let me see your loving hand. Let me handle my fear. Let me respond to it in a godly, faithful way. So it is my hope that you will remember the power and the love of Jesus in all your trials, so that you may be calm in the storm. May the Lord bless you and keep you.